I'll try. Okay, I'll just share my whole desktop. I've got nothing dodgy up. Right, so let's go to this, and this meeting is being recorded. Yep. And then I'll hit play. Okay, right. Okay. Is there a way to minimize that? Because I can't actually see my own. Yeah, there we go. There we go. Right. Okay, well, firstly, thank you for inviting me to this. This is my first talk I've given to the EpiNowcast community. Sam has been hassling me for a while. So it's nice to have it's nice to have a chance to do this. So as Sam introduced at the beginning, this is going to be about some modeling and forecasting work. Mainly people from the University of Warwick, including myself, did, but not exclusively from there. Over the course of I think about 4 or 5 months, in the sort of spring through summer and into autumn of 2022 on Mpox, because that was a surprising outbreak for most people because we hadn't really seen it. We haven't really seen a epidemic of Mpox in high income countries. Yeah, so the other people who are in on this team, I'll get around to properly introducing them later. But there's Thomas House from University of Manchester, Fergus Cumming, and other people who are listed on the paper from the UK Health Security Agency. I've also listed Kemry Wellcome Trust because I was working with them at that time. Yeah, and the umbrella organization for the epi modelers at the University of Warwick is known as the Zeeman Institute, or SPIDER. Right, okay, so yeah, so the way I'm going to do this talk is it's going to talk about the model. It's going to talk about how the model evolved over time, and it's also going to be a kind of personal reflection on what was happening to me. So it's going to be like a personalized account. I'm going to attempt to be honest about where I think I got things wrong. And then hopefully in the discussion stage, we can talk about what that flags up for things to avoid for forecasting anything in the, any infectious disease in the future. Right. So I think Mpox really arrived on my radar. Well, Mpox, I was aware of monkeypox, as we called it back then, as an endemic disease in sub-Saharan Africa, borderline endemic. But kind of growing. And I've been aware of it for a number of years through my connection to modeling infectious diseases in sub-Saharan Africa. But it wasn't a focus of mine because I was focused on respiratory viruses. Then there was this moderately surprising outbreak that was notified, I believe, in late April or May 2022. That's when I first noticed it. And then in my community of people I talked to about epi modeling, so this Juniper network that some of the people here are involved with, this sort of became aware that this was increasingly surprising and increasingly worrying because the incidence kept growing, and we started to talk a lot about how the skew in incidence was heavily towards gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men. So I abbreviate that to GBMSM throughout this talk. And it was less household based. So the classic epidemiology of Mpox tended to be sporadic household based outbreaks in sub-Saharan Africa. And that was kind of my mental model of it. And this strongly differed from my mental model. So there was a lot of chat about how a network model that captured the sexual contact graph of GBMSM and maybe other people, or people who sort of mixed in multiple sexual communities, would be an appropriate way of trying to do a model-based analysis of Mpox. And at that point, I was moderately interested, but I don't have a lot of experience with network models. But as Mpox incidents kept growing in June, I decided, along with my PI, James Noakes, PI at the time, that we should probably try some forecasting. And so I'll describe what we tried to do. And that was around June 2022. So yeah, so as I mentioned, this was the original core group. So this widens out later on. So I couldn't find an image for Massimo, who did a lot of work on this. We were all based at the Zeeman Institute at Warwick. And there's me at the top right. Middle left is Matt Keeling, who is the director of the institute. Middle right is Laura. Bottom right is Joe Hilton, and bottom left was my PI at the time, James Noakes, who was also my connection to the Kemmery Wellcome Trust Centre in East Africa, and basically greenlighted shifting some time away from COVID in East Africa towards Mpox in the UK. And in June, these were like some of the key bits of data information we had. So there was this early paper on the incubation period, which was around about 8.8 days reported from Miura et al. I think a lot of people use that. There was a paper which was co-authored by another guy at Warwick, where they'd done a reasonably extensive analysis of the rate of generating new sexual partners per year amongst GBMSM people, how it had a power law distribution, what that like power law scaling is. There was information from the ONS about like the proportion of men over 18 who self-identified as GBMSM and how many of them were sexually active, etc. NHS reporting on the vaccine uptake. And then I can't remember when the first one dropped, but at least in June, I think that's the UKHSA had started putting out technical briefings. And this included a description of the proportion of cases which self-identified as GBMSM among all the cases where that data was available. But in terms of fitting the model, the actual time series data was from global. Is that what they were called? Oh, I forget. I think they were called global.health. It's the people that it's like an online dashboard, but I'd need to go like double check that was their name. I haven't used that dashboard for a very long time now. And a key thing, and I'm going to highlight in red anywhere in the talk where I basically did something at the time that became very questionable later on. Early on, my reading or my understanding of the monkeypox or the Mpox epidemiology was that the symptomatic period was also the infectious period. So basically, if you didn't have symptoms, you weren't infectious yet. And that was just straight out wrong. That was an assumption that turned out to be wrong, and that had like sort of moderately poor consequences. So we'll get on to that. Anyway, so like sexual contact networks, like so as I mentioned before, it seemed like a natural model formulation for something that was clearly spreading predominantly, but not exclusively, via sexual contacts. And so the kind of obvious question as a modeler or a forecaster is like, well, why would you want to implement a model like that? And what does it give you that other models don't give you? Well, like two big things it gives you is one, it gives you clustering of contacts. So I've managed to so that's essentially like triangles in the contact graph, and I've managed to make a conceptual model where I believe there are no triangles in it. But this is like in contrast to random contact models at kind of like, which are basically based on like kinetics, where the probability of there being a triangle in the contact graph is essentially zero. In social network models, you can like bake in strong clustering contacts, and also heterogeneous nodes. So some people will have wildly more sexual contacts than other people. So in this kind of conceptual model of the graph, you can see that this person in the center is a lot more connected to, has a much higher connectivity than the other people in the graph. And both of those can be important for capturing the spread of an epidemic, because obviously if a highly connected nodes get infected, then that boosts transmission. But on the other hand, clustering on the average tends to reduce the rate of spread in epidemic situations, because you get local saturation of susceptible people, which kind of decreases the aggregate spread through the population in a similar way to how that happens in like spatial models, for example. The main problem with sexual contact graphs is that they're very complicated. It's hard to, it's computationally challenging to simulate them, and therefore it's computationally challenging to make inferences from data on them. I'm actually a referee on a paper that has come out, which does do a really detailed approach on that, and that paper will hope is pretty good. So hopefully that'll be available for the community when they've done their corrections. But to put it, put in mind, I get the understanding that the people who did that paper with the full tech model started about like 2 years ago, so like or 18 months ago. So it's hard to be timely with a network-based approach. So I took a much simpler approach. So having identified like 2 things that you really wanted to grab out of the sexual contact graph model, I tried to see if I could replace them with a simple grouping model. So what's happening here is the whole population, including people who do not identify as GBMSM, have a background heterogeneous transmission process. So that's like the outer black box. And then the people who are in the GBMSM, sorry, I use MSM interchangeably, I apologize for that, get a 2-way grouping. One is by their sexual activity. So I've collapsed the details of each individual into a discrete number of groups. And the other way is through these randomly sized metapopulations, which and with the definition that 99% of your infections are inside your own metapopulation. So the sexual activity groups is trying to capture the node heterogeneity I mentioned. So it will group together. So it will capture individuals in the population who have typically more new sexual partners. And the other aggregation of the population is into groups that are essentially restricted from infecting each other, to try and capture some of the mechanism by which clustering can reduce the overall spread in a population. And I'll get on to how I parameterized the random sized metapopulations. And you can see that at one extreme, it can recover no metapopulation, so everyone will be in basically one. And at the other extreme, it can be that everyone's into like aggregated into equal size groupings. So to make that concrete, what happens at every simulation is that we basically chose a hyperparameter which was 50. So there's like maximum 50 different groups of people that the GBMSM people are going to be distributed between. None of the groups are a priori more likely to have occupants than others. They don't have that meaning. They're just a mechanism to break people up into groups that communicate much more within group compared to out of group. And then you're left over with one free parameter, which I call alpha here, to generate these group sizes from a Dirichlet multinomial distribution. So if alpha is really, really small, so like here's me drawing like a ordered by group size distribution from that for a quite small value of alpha, you find that like that 1 or 2 groups are overwhelmingly bigger than the other groups, and like most of these selected groups have size 0. So that favors an explanation that is much closer to a more classic sexual transmission model, where there isn't this clustering, but you do only have like random partnership, right? So extra heterogeneity that I've baked into the model that we don't observe, but is there to try and capture some features that we believe might be important. And then for contrast, bottom right, like the multinomial, which is essentially the alpha to infinity limit. And then you get, there's like an intermediate regime for like a quite moderately high value of alpha. Breaking down the sexual activity groups, we went for a equipartitional sexual encounters. So we used that power law that I mentioned at the top from Whittles et al. And we broke the GBMSM population down into 10 groups. Again, that's like a discrete hyperparameter. It could have been 20, it could have been 5. But we've broken them down, instead of by equal numbers of people, it's by equal generated sexual encounters. So each one of these sexual activity groups generates the same number of sexual encounters, even though this is a log scale. And so the most active group has an extremely high rate of generating new sexual partners. So you can see that on the right. Another thing we did, which was moderately arbitrary, and possibly we could have tried varying, was that later on, when we considered targeted vaccination, we basically assumed that it's only people who are having on average one or more new partners each month who would be going to seek the vaccine that became available, the Imvanex, or Jynneos as it's called in America. So that was moderately arbitrary. That was basically to disaggregate between people that were moderate to high sexually active and basically not inactive but low sexual activity. So that like describes the way in which we tried to generate a convenient population structure in terms of epidemic modeling, because once you generate this population structure, you basically have all the non-GBMSM people, which is the majority, and then you have the GBMSM people, where they're broken up into these groups with the label G for sexual activity group and M for metapopulation. Then having aggregated the population, you can then apply like a simple compartmental epidemic model structure. In our first pass, we didn't have this P category. So this is pre-symptomatic. You just went from S to E to I to R, with the transition probabilities each day being inferred, and the number of stages. So this is like a multi-stage model, where I haven't put in all the stages, but we inferred the number of stages to match up with the incubation period standard deviation, that the data structure we saw at the top. The role of vaccines is assumed to be infection blocking. So if you get vaccinated, you get a lower probability of infection per sexual contact, or relative to your force of infection. But if you then do get infected, it's assumed that it has no like further effect. That's how we implemented the vaccines, which again is that the most reasonable assumption? That's not clear. I'd be really interested what the community thinks at the end. The force infection is broken into two terms, one of which is basically a random preference model with this metapopulation structure on top for new sexual contacts between GBMSM people. And then the other is a homogeneous mixing term for lambda other, which just includes everyone. And that is the only way in which non-GBMSM people can catch Mpox in this model. So for the first pass model, before we had pre-symptomatic infection, we had a parameter for how long the infectious period would be effectively, but we assumed that this kind of like 8-9 days of incubation period was a non-transmission period. And so so the first projections I found that I've saved were from the end of June. The way we fitted this was we fitted using ABC with a beta binomial observation probability. So you basically generate your infection curves according to the model we saw on the last slide. And then I used a relative L1 distance. So you generate the infection curves, then you sample from the incidence of people transitioning from E to I. So basically transitioning out of their latent phase, which originally we assumed was the same as its incubation period. And then some of those people get sampled to become observed. And the observation delay was that whatever week you got observed in, you would be reported in the next week. And then we didn't use the last week of data because of like right censoring. I can almost feel like Sam Abbott exploding at this point. So hopefully he can contain his shouting until later. Yeah, and then we looked at like 4 main scenarios, one of which was a model where there could be a change in behavior at any point up to the end of July, and that change of behavior would be expressed as reducing the probability of transmission per contact, with an agnostic view of whether that was actually a true reduction in transmission, or an awareness where if you saw someone with like palsy symptoms, you would like avoid sexual contact with them, like because we've got like underlying Poisson contact assumptions, therefore you can't really tell the difference between those two things, but there was something that reduced the probability by an amount that was inferred, another target for inference in the model. But we looked at some other counterfactuals, which was like, what if that never happened? What if the vaccines that which were starting to be deployed at the end of July, what if they didn't fail for some reason, i.e. that they were not effective, no one, very low uptake, any reason why they wouldn't have worked, and also like the reasonable worst case scenario of like everything failed, right? And so like our early projections were that it was not going to explode into a really big epidemic, but that we believed it would keep growing and then it would peak in August, right? And this turned out to be wrong, and we'll see that in the next slide. The seeming main risk here was like if the vaccines didn't work. So the early view of this model was that the vaccines were going to play a really critical role, a moderately important role. However, like a few weeks later, we realized that was too pessimistic. Okay, and we also realized that these graphs I'm generating, they're actually a technical mistreatment of the underlying unobserved infection process. Because what I was doing was I was sampling parameters from the posterior distribution, and then I was doing my forecast as just like forecasting epidemics going forwards, which is actually which is like a reasonable approach for ODE models where the parameters specify the whole epidemic trajectory. But actually what I should be doing, and what we moved on to doing, was saving the unobserved random variables, such as the number of people who are infected on each day, right? And then when you project forwards, you should be projecting from that that posterior distribution of not just the model parameters, but also the latent infection process. And my only excuse is that I was doing this quite quickly. And so you can see this got like absolutely horrendous like PIs here. They're really, really broad. And the reason they're so broad is that obviously even with the quote unquote correct parameters, you can get early die out in models like this. So like surprisingly, there was like at the bottom end, there was just a whole bunch of trajectories where it just didn't really happen for it. So at that point, like we'd put a preprint out there, and we also felt we had like reasonable evidence it was going to tip over soon. In fact, we were already at the peak. We didn't realize that at the time, but we believed it would be peaking like moderately soon. This was when we connected more with Thomas House, who you see in the top left from the University of Manchester, who also had or has a role at UKHSA. Massimo, through a different project, had a role at UKHSA. They basically put us in touch with Fergus, who you can see on the bottom left, and his team, who are named but I don't have pictures for, at UKHSA. So what changed? Well, firstly, other work in UKHSA came out which showed that the generation interval for Mpox was a lot shorter than we expected. So originally, we believed that there was about 8 days before symptoms, and you weren't transmitting until symptoms, and that you were transmissible while you had symptoms, which is 2 to 4 weeks. But we assumed that you wouldn't just keep on transmitting as you got worse and worse symptoms. So we fitted that as a model parameter, but it meant that the lowest possible the lowest possible generation interval we could get was about 9 days for the old model. But if you went to that limit, you would essentially have an R0 of 0. So, you know, that was an issue. Ward et al. Showed like pretty convincingly the mean generation time for Mpox was about 9.5 days. And that there was almost certainly a reasonably substantial role for pre-symptomatic infection. So that's when we built the pre-symptomatic phase into the model. And the second advance was that because through our contact with UKHSA, we had access to the full line list. And the full line list, and we could give scripts to be run on UKHSA machines to then create like aggregated data sets to then run like our model on, which was really, really handy, as we'll get onto in the next slide. I'm getting talks. Okay. Right. Now, one of the ways in which that was super handy was that until that point, we'd basically be going off UKHSA situation reports, which were mostly saying that like kind of like maybe like 90% of the cases were GBMSM status in the UK. When you actually burrowed into the line list, you found the reasonably large majority of the cases, I think about 70%, didn't actually have an entry for GBMSM. But that was left with 30% that did. So Massimo came up with the idea of running boosted trees to get a probabilistic assignment to the GBMSM status of these missing data individuals. And in the framework of our model, because we were fitting on ABC with a relative L1 error, it was like very convenient to have probabilistic cases. So like, you know, if you have a time series where you're sort of saying like, okay, there's been like 10 GBMSM cases this week and like 1 non-GBMSM or whatever, right? You like the way we were fitting the model, you could just as well say like 10.2 versus like 1.3 or whatever. So what we did was we made a probabilistic assignment of status to all the missing data individuals based on the, I think it was 69 other predictor variables that were in the line list. And then on each new week of collected data, we like when we aggregated, we basically summed unassigned status cases to both columns, weighted by their probabilistic assignment. So they sort of went into both columns. The information gain that we were getting from the decision trees was interesting. Like kind of maybe not unsurprisingly, the top information gain was on like if you were sex female, like I think and then like the other ones were about dates and then sex male, because not everyone had, like lots of people were not lots, but there were cases that had neither female nor male, like as an attached as a filled variable.
Damn, you've got about 5 minutes.
Okay, cool. Right. So this was like really handy underneath the hood, and the data was a lot less noisy than being reported by the dashboard we were using previously. So yeah, so like better data, better version of the model, rerunning the Bayesian analysis, still using the same ABC protocol. Like what did we find out from the parameters directly? Well, the kind of there was like pretty good identification of where the probability of transmission potential contact was, and for our model we were getting about like 45%. It was peaking. Yeah, there's quite a wide 95% credible interval, but like stuff we and it was really excluding a role for non-GBMSM people, because like there were so few cases among that. It was basically all of them were supposed to be downstream from GBMSM cases. Oops. All right. Right, there we go. But you can see the probability of case detection has not shifted far from like our prior. Our prior was that it wouldn't be close to 0 and it wouldn't be close to 1. And then we basically get a posterior that is moderately similar. Unsurprisingly, when you burrow into the corner plots, there is a like non-identifiability issue here where it can't really tell very strongly between probability of transmission and probability of detection, which is a classic issue. But also this first column is that meta-population size parameter alpha that I mentioned in the previous slide. So that plays the role of slowing down epidemic by creating effectively more cluster structure. And unsurprisingly, it has not quite as bad as the straight up transmission to detection non-identifiability, but like it makes it moderately tricky to identify all those parameters. The posterior distribution for like these metapopulation group sizes is kind of like more towards the low alpha region. So it but with a moderately good probability that they're broken up into at least like 30 cliques or something. And then like the kind of magnitude we were getting of here we look at R0, like true R0 without susceptibility depletion. And then the dashed line is the effective R0 or RT as it's often called. So we then see that where we believe there was a role for at some point there being a change before July. Later on, we were there could be an effect for the WHO declaration. The model seemed to like that, mainly because that happened exactly at the peak. So, the model could go aha, was it possibly because the WHO declared a public health emergency of international concern? And is that why it peaked exactly right then? So you can see that coincides exactly with RT goes below 1 pretty much. So that peak point at July. Another thing that surprised us is we believe that the vaccines would play quite an important role of turning over the epidemic. That clearly wasn't true because they only really came in July. So in that case, we became more interested in what if there was a very rapid reversion to the same risk. And thankfully, our central forecast of that not happening turned out to be more accurate. This is kind of one. So this thing I've highlighted in red is I recently saw a paper a few weeks ago, maybe last month. So our central fit on this, remember we didn't have any seroprevalence data, was that about 1.2% of the whole sexually active group of GBMSM in the UK had caught Mpox, which felt very high at the time. But recently there was a paper out where they actually look at this among GBMSM visitors to health clinics in Rotterdam and Amsterdam. It's actually a bit higher, 5.1% was their central estimate. Once they account for childhood vaccination against smallpox, which and the vaccination rate of the people who are there. That's the Chamier et al. Is well worth a read. So at least we're ballparking the right thing and actually a bit lower, although it's tricky to decide. The model also believed that behavior change and vaccines mitigated about half of the outbreak, but with moderately high uncertainty. So this is a technical slide about how we ran other model structures, sequentially forecasting on historic data to see which ones did well. And that's why we selected the model with behavior change in this random population size. It did a bit better over the course of the epidemic. I'm happy to go back to that if questions.
Got about a minute.
Yeah.
Cool.
So the conclusions of this, I think the headline parameter that seemed quite well identified was about once you fitted the model to the mean generation time, accounted for the fact there was moderately reasonable amount of pre-symptomatic transmission, you have an effective infectious period of about a week. And the model was fitting about 43% risk of transmission per sexual contact. So if you're having more than about 2 new sexual contacts per week, so you're really spreading out the infection into your community, that's sufficient to sustain an outbreak. But from the data we have, that's quite a small proportion of the GBMSM people in the UK. So that suggests that so long as the vaccine has reasonable efficacy, repeated vaccination is likely to be effective to keep stopping this. Obviously, there's been reports of people who got vaccinated during the first wave who have now had breakthrough infections, although I don't think anywhere has seen a second wave. And maybe that highlights that repeated is the key word there. the model favors an explanation of behavior change, but there's actually been a reasonably widespread debate in the modeling community about the role of behavior change in how Mpox turned over. So we favor it, but as I was trying to be honest with in the corner plot slide, it's not super identifiable. I wouldn't say that this was an absolute slam dunk, although I would say this should shift your posterior belief in favor of believing there's a role for behavior change. And yeah, and there's my acknowledgements. I snuck in acknowledgement for CDC because I work for them now, and they have been very kind letting me have some time for doing this. I didn't ask very strongly, but yeah, the forecasting platform for this hopefully will get integrated into the CFA like ensemble of models that are available, or not, depending on like what people think about it. Yeah, and thanks to everyone at Warwick, miss you guys, Manchester, Cemre, and yeah, in the UK HSA. The end.
Awesome. That was really good. Thanks, Sam.
Oh yeah, I've got some future directions if people want to talk about them as well. Basically, get more Seroprev info.
Awesome. Does anyone who has questions, feel free to put your hand up. If you don't want to speak, then feel free to just type in chat and I can read them out. Oh, Nick, very fast off the gun. Off you go.
I have two questions.
Go for
Has
it.
anyone asked people, GBMSM people, if they changed their behavior in 2022?
Yeah.
And I think the 5.2% is consistent with the 2.9% because the latter thing was measured in two big cities in clinic Ds, right? And so that's a biased subset of all sexually active GBMSM. Question and comment.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said the second thing because I almost said it myself, but then I didn't want to sound too much like the guy who is like, every bit of evidence, if you look at it in the right way, is evidence for why my model was right. So yeah, I do. So for like, for anyone that didn't fully follow that transaction, so the point is that the 1.2% is over all this group, all the GBMSM people from these different sexual activity groups, and that's like. But then people who are visiting a health clinic in a big city in the Netherlands are probably more likely to be in these higher sexual activity groups, right? So like getting a baseline of everyone at about 1.2 is not inconsistent with this study that found about 5.1%. So yeah, thanks, Nick. And sorry, what was your first point again?
It was there any surveys on whether GBMSM changed their behavior?
Yeah, a whole bunch of them. It's been ages since I submitted this paper, but like if you get the chance to read the paper, in the discussion section we list a bunch. It's always tricky to interpret them, right? So I didn't use them as direct priors. I would probably use them as a prior to say like it's likely that there was a behavior change effect, right? There was a whole bunch. There was one that we link some in at least one from Australia, like a couple from the UK, and I'm sure there were more. I don't think I got to an exhaustive list. And it was all the conclusions I saw was that if you were in the GBMSM community, you're more likely to have heard of monkeypox or Mpox compared to not, right? And you're at least likely to be concerned about it, and at least moderately likely to say you were going to change your behavior, right? It's always tricky because then it's like there's there's intentionality versus like reality, right? So yeah, we saw those studies and we didn't go like, right, I'm going to use as a prior like 10% because 10% of the people said they were worried about it. But yeah, we do quote them as supporting the view of having some kind of role for behavior change.
I don't know who was first, so I'm
Yeah,
going
you
to say it
were.
was
I think you're
okay.
first. Go
Oh,
ahead.
me. I was going to go last. Okay, cool. My question is not about what you presented. My question, which was fascinating, my question is about something you said. So you said multiple times, we decided, and I was just wondering what the
Mm.
decision-making process you had for we decided,
All right.
and if you had any thoughts about how to do like stressful collaborative work in real time, because you had quite a lot of authors on this from different institutions.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and anything you would improve on in the future if you were, I don't know, working in an organization that was planning to improve responses.
So I don't, one can speculate. No, one can speculate. Right. Okay. So the work pattern, I've got to cast my mind back. So the work pattern, firstly, it came from like general conversations with the community, which I did mention. So I don't know if everyone on here has heard of Juniper, but it's the consortium of universities where there's some epi modeling going on, right? And we give like talks and have coffee, like online coffee together and stuff. And so obviously there was a lot of chatter on that. So that raised awareness. Then because my focus at the time was COVID in Kenya or East Africa in general, Slack chat and stuff, to start with, right? And then I was kind of like interested, but I wasn't going to take time out of my work. But as it got worse in June, I expected our funders, Wellcome Trust, to start asking like what modelers they were funding and what they were thinking about Mpox. So I built like the Noddy version of this model as like just to see what would happen and ran that. I can't even remember all the Noddy details, but I did have the random metapopulation size thing in there on the first pass. And then that seemed to fit the curve moderately reasonably. So then I brought in like everyone else on the original round of authors who were on the first preprint. And then we like chatted it through. So I chatted through what the proposal was, and then they suggested changes and stuff. And then after the first preprint, that kind of made more noise. And then like UKHSA were more interested in like supporting the model to improve it. And then it improved a lot, right? Because we had better data access, and the stuff they've been doing on incubation periods or on generation time intervals and stuff came out from Ward et al. And I think that's roughly the same time you and Chris Overton, right, did like a really cool nowcasting paper on the same data set, if I recall.
Well, Chris did a really cool nowcasting paper, and I was on it. But yes, cool. That was really interesting. Caitlin.
I think Kelly was before me.
Okay, I'll go quick. Mine's not a question, more of a starting an argument.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not convinced that pre-symptomatic transmission is as much of an issue with Mpox. I don't think it's been settled. I thought the data that from that Ward paper was kind of sketchy, and we wrote a comment about that article saying as much. And I think if there is pre-symptomatic transmission for Mpox, it's quite limited, like very short window. And I also want to make the distinction between like true pre-symptomatic transmission, which is where someone actually has no symptoms at all. So there's no possible way that they could know, like literally no signs. And then having symptoms, but not recognizing them as such, because you can change the latter with education. You can say, oh, if you have small blisters or lesions, like get those checked out, it could be Mpox. Whereas if you have truly no symptoms at all, there's nothing that you can do, like full body scan included, that will tell you that you have symptoms. So that is my argument.
Okay. So like the first thing here is like there's like that. I mean, like this always drives us modelly mathy people wild, right? Because it's like, well, what is your definition? What is your definition? So I mean, it's convenient mathematically to have a transition moment, right? Between like having absolutely no, we assume like two hard transition moments essentially, where there's like you have so few symptoms, or like you've caught it, but you're definitely not infectious, right? And then this kind of like pre-symptomatic period where you're like less infectious. We sort of fit a less infectiousness thing to make sure we get the reported mean generation interval, right? And then like you're like full-blown infectious, right? So basically I agree with that. Where the model pushes you towards things, right, is that if you believe that there is a shorter generation period, then it's easier for the epidemic to have like a sharp turnover. And we do in fact see that like sharp turnover. Like you can see it's actually like quite a sharp turnover. In my original run of this model, which used basically like that you like during your incubation period, you were like totally uninfectious, and then you were infectious for some period of time until you were like, oh my God, it's got really bad, right? It was very hard to capture that like sharp transition because the information seemed to be that it would take about like 8-9 days mean to like develop symptoms. And so for it to even be spreading in the population, you need to be like, unless you believe people are like having wild amounts of sexual contacts, and we think a sub community are, but like, do you know what I mean? It's very hard to get like a really sharp turnover. Does that make sense? So as soon as we had like this period which softened out the bit between you've caught it, but you're definitely not transmitting, and like you're transmitting full bore, but this is the point at which you can like be reported and truncate sort of truncate your sexual interactions and whatnot.
Is there another possible explanation?
I mean, like the thing is that this basic structure is like simplistic enough that actually you can fit loads of different explanations into this basic structure, right? That's what I'm saying. Like what comes out of the model is definitely that it needed something to soften that hard transition out, right? I'm not sure, like I'm pretty sure you could come up with different mechanistic interpretations that would lead to similar stuff. Because the simplest way of saying this is like there's a period where you're infected but completely uninfectious, a period when you're like maximally infectious, and then a soft in between period, right? And then like you could say that like actually maybe that's people with very limited symptoms where they're not, maybe some of those people with limited symptoms are having their partners or themselves or they themselves paying attention to it, or not, right? So yeah, I would not say that this is evidence to go to war on any strong interpretation of the fundamental epidemiology. It is evidence that you do need to soften out the totally uninfectious to maximum infectious period to capture the sharp peak in the data, right?
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So that's not really an argument.
No, I guess. Well, I mean, it was sort of a debate, I think, in the literature. So anyway. Okay, Caitlin, you want to go?
Sure. I just had like 2 clarifying questions. And I apologize, I didn't read the paper before. So what is the mechanism of like the behavior change coming into this model? Like, is that the per contact transmission probability decreased, or is it that the sexual network changed? Was my first question. Go ahead, you can answer that one.
So it's it's either a decrease in contact rates or a decrease in probability of transmission per contact, and this model can't tell those apart.
Okay, no. So you have you have both of those in there, and they're just, that's another set of parameters that are identifiable.
It's basically like these groups set a Poisson rate of creating new transmission, right? And in a Poisson, like you can't, like a Poisson by like its mathematical nature. It's like you can't tell the difference between lower rate or thinned out, if you see what I mean. So you could have either lower rate, or you could, like, every time an event occurs, actually you say like, oh no, there's some probability it doesn't occur.
Like,
and actually those two are exactly, then they're mathematically interchangeable.
Right, because that's
So
just a factor in front of it. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
That
Right.
makes sense. And then the other question, I don't know if you have time for this, but when you explained how you were doing it wrong because you were simulating forward from the posterior parameters and not the latent variables. Can you just explain that again? Because I thought my understanding of this is your posterior parameters will generate your latent incident infections, and then and then you're projecting from there.
I actually thought about putting up a slide of math, and I didn't, and I wish I had now. So this was a subtle point that I did not, I think I got wrong at the time, and actually a reviewer on the paper when it came out in Nature Comms pointed this out, and I was really pleased for it. So you can imagine, like, you've got parameters, so like your transmission probability per contact and that kind of thing, right? But for a stochastic model, they do not define exactly what the incidence on any given day is, right? Because there's still this extra random part of, like, whatever the parameters are, there's some, like, you assume that there's some random variation. So actually the likelihood of the data depends on both the parameters and the incidence trajectory. So, like, you can look at both sets. You can therefore say, like, right, when you do this Bayesian inference, you get a joint posterior distribution for the parameters and the incidence on each day in both the GBMSM and the non-GBMSM groups, right? So they come attached. Like, it's like a big long set of parameters, and it's interesting to look at every form of simulating from that. But if you're doing forecasting, like, part of the evidence of the epi curve is towards what random events happened in transmission. Like, for example, if the epi curve is going up, you know for a fact you didn't get, like, random die out. So stochastic models can have, like, random die out, right? You could rerun the model with exactly the same parameters, and you could get, like, immediate die out or very soon die out of the epidemic. And it can be interesting to look at the counterfactuals in that point of view. But when you're doing forecasting, which was the, like, main goal of this, you should really be using the posterior distribution for all the latent unobserved random variables, because that is the state of the epidemic that you've got the most evidence for, if that makes sense.
No,
so,
that makes a lot of sense.
I didn't do that here, and I've got, like, these really, really giant PIs.
Okay.
And then I did it the right way here, right? So this is looking retrospectively at the posterior distribution of generating observations from the posterior distribution of infections. But then when you project forwards, it's from that distribution at the end. The little tricky wrinkle is, if you look at counterfactuals, you can see I started them from when the vaccines occurred. Right. So it's basically like, I'm assuming that everything was exactly the same until you got the first set of vaccines, and then you do different forward trajectories.
Right. I think we're going to have to wrap now and do any more conversation async. Though I would add, I'm aware of 2 separate bits of work on exactly this question to make it easier to do this right. Which is good.
Yeah. When you start thinking about it, it's like, oh yeah. So which is the right distribution, right? Is any of them by Alex Cook? Alex Cook had a cool paper on something like this.
No, they're new. They're not out yet. Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. Oh, interesting. Right.
Yeah.
He had it for foot and mouth disease, which was interesting.
Yeah. Cease. Excellent. That was really good, Sam. Thank you very much. We've lost quite a few people in the last couple of minutes, but I think people had a nice time.
I'm used to it.
Yeah, but excellent. That's it. Next month, we have Rebecca Bortring talking about informing short-term forecast of categorical trends in confirmed influenza hospital admissions in the US using RT estimates from EpiNow2. That's quite a long title, but I think it's going to be quite exciting. Yeah, excellent. And then after that, we have a gap. So if anyone has any suggestions for someone who might be feeling like giving a talk at the very beginning of January, then that would be very welcome. Awesome. I'll stop recording now.